And though it is not exactly our usual day, but I see that you're still awake enough to see that it's a Wednesday rather than a Thursday and still be able to join us. And I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Lightman, who's a professor of humanities at York University. And as most of you will know, he's the editor of ISIS, a leading journal in the history of science. And he has been the editor of ISIS now for quite a long time, like from 2004, for 2 periods, and then now a further extension. So essentially, they don't want to let him go. But he will at some point free himself from that duty. Professor Lightman has been working mostly on 19th century science and its intersections with Victorian culture, Victorian society, and has edited a number of collections of essays in this field. He has written on religion and Victorian science, and particularly in 2007, 2 books came out, which I just want to point your attention to. A collection of essays called Science in the Marketplace, 19th century Sights and Experiences, and a monograph, Victorian Popularizers of Science, Designing Nature for New Audiences. And I just, these have been actually groundbreaking books in the field of Victorian science, and particularly popularization of science. And in the monograph, I would say that Professor Lightman really comes up with an interesting new framework through which we can understand Victorian popularization of science, whereby we really need to look carefully at these popularizers, at this very diverse group of people, men and women, who are doing this popularization of science, whose ideas are very often in interesting contrast with that of the scientific elite. So, in a way, it's an invitation to abandon traditional models of science communication, coming from above, and actually explore the vivacity, this kind of very lively debates that are going on in Victorian science at the level of popularization, which very often are in interesting kind of dialectical contrast with the elite science. Of course, this is an age in which science is not completely professionalized, so there is that kind of space that will be later on closed down. The talk today is not on this topic, but is an essay that is going to be part of a collection of essays. And I think I'll just let Professor Lightman introduce you to the topic. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Lightman.
We go. The red light went on, but now it's not on. Yep. Okay. Yeah, so let me explain a little more about where this is coming from before I start in. So I found myself over the years sort of torn between, bouncing back and forth between looking at elite scientists in the Victorian period and popularizers. And I found that it's actually helped me to understand both by bouncing back and forth. So this is not a paper about the popularization of science. It's very definitely about elite scientists and their relationship to the intellectual elite. And the reason I got into this was I had the opportunity to be involved in a project to edit and publish the papers of the Metaphysical Society. I had wanted to do this for many years, tried to do it about 12 years ago, and Oxford would not allow the papers to be published. And then a woman from France by the name of Catherine Marshall, a Walter Bagehot scholar, contacted me and said that Oxford had agreed to let her have the papers published. And so she persuaded me to drop other things that I was doing to get involved in the project, and I'm glad I did. And with another colleague in the field who does religious history, a fellow by the name of Richard England, we have edited all the papers, and we're sort of in the final stages of doing that over the summer, and then they'll come out at about 3 volumes in about a year and a half. So Oxford University Press is doing it. And as I was reading through them, I was taking copious notes because I got all sorts of ideas about the importance of this society, and so this paper is the result of that. So I'll be interested to see what you think. I still be working on the papers. If you give me some good questions and ideas, could change how I some of the editing. In 1877, William Allingham, a poet with connections to the pre-Raphaelite school of painters and writers, then editor of Fraser's Magazine, wrote a piece for his own journal under the pseudonym of Unus de Multis that blasted what he called the creed of the future, as promulgated by modern prophets. Though this new creed had, quote, not yet been put into any formal shape, Allingham believed that it would be tantamount to atheistic materialism. For the modern prophets, among whom he included scientists such as T.H. Huxley, John Tyndall, and W.K. Clifford, grounded their obnoxious creed on the assumption that, quote, physical science is competent to deal with the total contents of human experience, the truth being that these are prophets translate every experience into materialistic formula, end of quote. In the past, Allingham said, atheism could only be found skulking in cheap newspaper and dingy discussion halls. But for the first time in the history of modern civilization, Allingham warned, quote, atheism is publicly and authoritatively inculcated in schools, classes, lectures to working men, lectures to the fashionable world, Sunday afternoon discourses, lay sermons of all sorts, books and periodicals addressed to people of every rank and every degree of culture, end of quote. But what bothered Allingham even more than the unprecedented public expression of atheism was a lack of any strong reaction against it. Quote, this important change in public opinion, he declared, is coming on without earthquake or tornado, quote. The religious authorities, he complained, treated the unbelievers with civility, since the professors of atheism are so polite. For proof, Allingham pointed to an exclusive but little-known society in which devout Christian leaders had foolishly accepted atheists as full members. Quote, have we not, Allingham asked, heard rumors of a metaphysical society as heterogeneous and harmonious as any happy family ever collected into one cage? Allingham feared that this society, which is far too accommodating to the atheistical modern prophets, would determine the future of Victorian culture behind closed doors. Though the Metaphysical Society was something of a mystery to contemporaries, its existence is fairly well known to historians. A debating club composed of the prominent British politicians, scientists, writers, journalists, and religious figures that met regularly from 1869 to 1880 would seem to be a particularly intriguing topic for investigation. As the neo-Marxist scholar Robert Young stated over 25 years ago, quote, just about everything concerning this society realizes a historian's daydreams, end of quote. And yet, astonishingly, there's little substantial scholarship dealing with the Metaphysical Society. The only book-length study, Alan Willard Brown's The Metaphysical Society, Victorian Minds in Crisis, was published in 1947. There are significant problems with Brown's book. Writing in the aftermath of the Second World War and in the shadow of the devastation wrought by intolerant fascism, Brown's treatment of the Metaphysical Society is colored by his perception of it as an admirable symbol of the faith and discourse that characterized 19th century liberalism. Although Young is enthusiastic about the Metaphysical Society as a potential research project, he spends only about 5 pages on it. He treats the Metaphysical Society as a turning point, a last attempt to maintain a common intellectual context. But Young's notion of a common intellectual context has come under increased criticism since the late 1880s, or 1980s, and so I'm going to offer a different interpretation. Today I'm going to argue that we should look at the Metaphysical Society as a forum wherein Victorian intellectuals grappled with the problem of defining knowledge in the specific context of the 1870s. That is, though the papers dealt with a series of seemingly disparate political, ethical, philosophical, and religious issues, the debates revolved around determining the true nature of science, and not merely the establishment of a definitive system of metaphysics. As the historian of science and religion Peter Harrison has pointed out, what we now refer to as science, a humanly constructed category, has over time had disputed content and contested boundaries. And during the 1870s in Britain, the debate about the content and boundaries was particularly fierce, as natural history and natural philosophy were being transformed into what we now call science, while the religious presuppositions grounding them were being questioned by scientific practitioners whose prestige had been enhanced by the controversies surrounding Darwin's theory of evolution. In the past, historians have tended to assume that by the 1870s, Christian theologians had virtually ceded scientific authority to the modern prophets so despised by Allingham. If that was true, then the contest appeared to be between scientific authorities and religious authorities. By contrast, I will maintain that the historical actors saw the debate as taking place between two sets of scientific authorities. In other words, Christian intellectuals were not willing to give up on science. They refused to recognize Huxley and his allies as the only legitimate scientific authorities who could speak on behalf of science, and who alone defined its boundaries, determined its content, and decided its larger cultural implications. Instead of accommodating themselves to the modern prophets, as Allingham feared, Christian intellectuals were resolved to undermine their power. The moving force behind the Metaphysical Society was the architect James Knowles. After founding the Metaphysical Society, he later became an important journal editor. In 1870, he assumed the editorship of the well-known journal Contemporary Review, but he left in 1877 to found the 19th Century. Some of you may be familiar with this important periodical. Knowles first conceived of the Metaphysical Society in November of 1868 when he was entertaining the poet Alfred Tennyson and the astronomer Charles Pritchard at his home in Clapham. During a stimulating debate on the crucial moral and theologicals of the day, the three men formed what Tennyson called a triangular duel. This inspired Knowles to establish a society devoted to discussing similar issues. He then contacted the major figures representing all schools of religious thought, from liberal Anglicanism to Catholicism, and later decided to include important scientists who were known religious doubters. A preliminary meeting was held at Willis's Rooms on April 21st, 1869, to create the society and to determine its purpose and functions. Knowles, Tennyson, and Pritchard were there. They were joined by the physiologist and Unitarian registrar of the University of London, W.B. Carpenter, the doctor and philosopher James Hinton, the editor of The Spectator and influential literary and religious critic R.H. Hutton, the Unitarian theologian Reverend James Martineau, poet, amateur, philosopher, and social reformer Rodin Noel, the historian and author of Ecce Homo, soon to be professor of modern history at Cambridge, J.R. Seeley, the liberal dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, Catholic theologian and formerly a leading figure in the Oxford movement, W.G. Ward, the banker, biologist, and anthropologist, Sir John Lubbock, and the biologist and Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. At the same meeting, 23 members were elected to the Society. Besides those present, the list included the physicist John Tyndall, the liberal politician and current Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, Catholic Archbishop of Westminster Henry Edward Manning, and historian, novelist, biographer, and honest doubter James Anthony Froude. Many members were elected during the life of this illustrious society. Among the most famous were the positivist Frederick Harrison, Catholic theologian and philosopher Father J.D. Delgairns, philosopher Henry Sidgwick, critic John Ruskin, liberal Anglican Frederick Denison Morris, Oxford professor of medicine Henry Acland, a psychologist and later founder and editor of Mind, G. Croom Robertson, mathematicians J.J. Sylvester and W.K. Clifford, zoologist and comparative anatomist St. George Mivart, editor of the Fortnightly Review and political thinker John Morley, editor, literary critic and historian Leslie Stephen, and philosopher and future Prime Minister A.J. Balfour. In the end, the Society included many of the most eminent statesmen, politicians, theologians, ecclesiastical figures, philosophers, historians, editors, and scientists. So it was a real all-star cast. The Society met once every month, excepting August, September, and October, from June 2nd to November 16th, 1880. For most of the life of the society, the meetings were held at a hotel in London. Dinner for those who wished it began at 6:30 p.m. and then the paper for that particular meeting was read at 8:30 p.m. Papers, sometimes in abridged form, were pre-circulated a week ahead of time. Knowles, who was honorary secretary for most of the life of the society, was responsible for determining who delivered the paper for each meeting. Hutton, who was a journal editor, took care of printing them at the Spectator's office. Discussion and debate followed the paper. During the existence of the society, 95 papers were read. So here's a sort of partial list. They covered theology, aesthetics, political thought, psychology, ethical issues, epistemology, and scientific topics. And often a paper on a particular subject drew forth a dissenting response at the next or a subsequent meeting. Knowles' basic idea for the Metaphysical Society was derived from the private male world of British clubs and scientific societies. At the preliminary meeting held on April 21, 1869, a motion was passed that, quote, no visitors, unless foreigners, were to be introduced at any meeting, quote. The papers themselves were marked private on the upper right-hand corner of the paper. The secrecy surrounding the society's meetings led to the suspicion, voiced by critics such as Allingham, that the society was undermining religious principles essential to British culture. Among outsiders, the society was known early on as the atheists. Knowles himself suffered from his association with the society when he published W.K. Clifford's famous essay, The Ethics of Belief, in the Contemporary Review in 1877, based on a paper that Clifford had delivered at the Metaphysical Society the previous year. It led to charges that he was too open to materialism, and the upshot was an acrimonious break with Alexander Strawn, the journal's publisher, and he ended up leaving the journal. Knowles believed that confidentiality was essential if members were to speak their minds freely on controversial subjects and to discuss the significance of the vast social, political, cultural, and religious changes that were leading to unprecedented intellectual upheaval in the 1870s. In his 1885 reminiscence of a typical meeting of the society, Hutton referred to the members' perception that they were living in a time of momentous change, as profound as any period in world history. Quote, everyone alike spoke of the extraordinary fermentation of opinion in the society around us, Hutton recalled. Moral and intellectual yeast was as hard at work multiplying its fungoid forms in the men who met at that table as even in the period of the Renaissance itself. During the 1860s, the intellectual landscape was shaken by the controversy over Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, the publication by progressive Anglican divines of essays and reviews in 1860, and the scandal surrounding Bishop Colensol's The Pentateuch in the Book of Joshua, critically examined in 1862, in which he questioned the historical accuracy of the Bible. Political discussions raged over the passing of the Second Reform Act of 1867, which enfranchised the urban male working class in England and Wales. Socialism and the trade union movement were beginning to make their presence felt in Britain. The Metaphysical Society was formed so that the intellectual elite could discuss how to respond to the evolution of Britain into a modern, industrialized, urbanized, and secular nation no longer dominated by the aristocracy or the Anglican Church. But the members of the society were deeply divided as to the way forward. Initially, at the preliminary meeting of the Metaphysical Society on April 21st, 1869, Huxley felt uncomfortable among the leading lights of the Victorian intellectual elite. By then, he was well established in the world of science. In the following year, he became president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. But ever since he had defended Charles Darwin's theory of evolution from attack following the publication of The Origin of Species, Huxley had been closely watched by his enemies. They suspected that he held materialistic and atheistic ideas. In his published writings, Huxley had been very careful not to provide his opponents with evidence for their suspicions. No respectable member of the intellectual elite could afford to be associated with forms of unbelief generally considered to be suspicious, vulgar, and radical in nature. Although Huxley did not subscribe to traditional Christian beliefs, he did not consider himself to be a materialist or an atheist. So now I'm going to tell a story about the origin of a term which some of you have probably heard before, but for those of you who haven't, it's fascinating. At the time, no term accurately described Huxley's complicated type of unbelief. By contrast, the others present at the meeting all had labels. Huxley recalled in 1889, quote, "Every variety of philosophical and theological opinion was represented there and expressed itself with entire openness. Most of my colleagues were ists of one sort or another, and however kind and friendly they might be, I, the man without a rag or a label to cover himself, could not fail to have some of the uneasy feelings which must have beset the historical fox when, after leaving the trap in which his tail remained, he presented himself to his normally elongated companions." Quote. So face to face with the keenest minds in Britain, Huxley began to worry that the ambiguous public image that he had crafted for himself would not stand up under the cut and thrust of debate. He needed a tail, like the other foxes, in order to take his place in the society. Huxley's response to his predicament was to coin the new term agnostic, which served to distance him from materialism and atheism. Huxley's dramatic recounting of why he created the word agnostic during the initial meeting of the Metaphysical Society indicates how the club played a crucial role in the process of his self-fashioning. Huxley would have considered the invitation to join the club as acknowledgement of his respectability and as symbolic of his entrance into the intellectual elite despite questions about his religious beliefs. Becoming an accepted member of the society was especially important for those like Huxley and his good friend John Tyndall, who came from humble lower middle class backgrounds. Since they had not been trained at Anglican Oxford or Cambridge, they were essentially outsiders. Huxley and Tyndall belonged to a group of scientifically influenced intellectuals who shared a vision of reforming British science and society. They argued that proper science required the exclusion of any reference to a divine being and stuck to studying observable causes and effects in nature. This amounted to a rejection of natural theology or any sort of religious framework for science. At the same time, Huxley and his allies fought to reduce the power of the Anglican Church in British society. They sought to undermine the cultural authority of the Anglican clergy, to present themselves as providing the best intellectual leadership for a modernized and industrialized Britain. They insisted that the key to understanding social, political, ethical, and aesthetic issues was a thorough understanding of science that only they possessed. This last claim was crucial in light of the growing power of scientific modes of thought from the middle of the 19th century. Increasingly, truths based on an appeal to sacred texts, to religious authorities, to an inner conscience, or to intuition of any kind were no longer seen as possessing intellectual credibility. Therefore, those who could claim to speak on behalf of science in this period gained immense cultural authority and controlled the intellectual agenda of the day. While Huxley designated his form of unbelief as agnosticism, he referred to the larger movement to redefine science and transform British society as scientific naturalism. The ranks of the scientific naturalists included the philosopher of evolution Herbert Spencer, the founder of eugenics Francis Galton, the statistician Carl Pearson, the anthropologist Edward Tyler, the biologist E. Ray Lankester, the doctor Henry Maudsley, and journalists and writers G.H. Lewes, Grant Allen, and Edward Clodd. None of the men I've just mentioned ever joined the Metaphysical Society. The 7 scientific naturalists who did become members, Huxley, Tyndall, Clifford, Lubbock, Leslie Stephen, Harrison, and Morley, constituted a small minority in the society. Over the course of its life, the society had 62 members in total, but the scientific naturalists were a vocal and active minority. Tyndall and Morley did not deliver any papers, but between them, Clifford, Huxley, Lubbock, Harrison, and Stephen accounted for 13 of the 95 papers, and they're among the most controversial. Many of the scientific naturalists were active participants in the debates following the presentation of a paper. Huxley, in particular, impressed a number of the members with his debating skills. Sidgwick, an avid critic of scientific naturalism, ranked Huxley as among the 2 best debaters in the society. In their papers, the scientific naturalists aggressively asserted the primary principles of their creed. The only valid knowledge was derived through empirical experience of a uniform natural world. This constituted a redefinition of science as previously understood in Britain. During the first half of the 19th century, science was defined according to the principles of natural theology. Science, Clifford declared in one of his papers, is the getting of knowledge from experience on the assumption of uniformity in nature. Quote, the uniformity of nature, or the dictum that like causes produce like effects, was an axiom for scientific naturalists. Leslie Stephen acknowledged that he could not be absolutely certain that uniformity would continue into the future, but he said it was unthinkable to believe otherwise. Quote, I believe in the uniformity of nature, Stephen announced, because I'm quite unable to conceive of any alternative, or any alternative except the negation of all thought. If I reason at all, I must employ this axiom. Quote, a denial of the uniformity of nature, according to Stephen, led to absolute skepticism, for it is to cut out the very nerve of proof, he said, in every proposition drawn from experience. The principles of scientific naturalism could be applied outside of a study of the natural world to the subjects of ethics and religion. For Clifford, for example, it was possible to build a scientific basis for morals. He remarked that science was, quote, the getting of knowledge from experience on the assumption of uniformity in nature and the use of such knowledge to guide the actions of man, quote. Science was therefore an integral part of determining the means towards obtaining any specific end. Despite their reputation for heterodoxy, many scientific naturalists insisted that the application of their principles to religion was not entirely destructive. Frederick Harrison, who was a positivist, told the other members of the Metaphysical Society that for those on our side of the question, there is, quote, ample scope for the spiritual life, for moral responsibility, for the world beyond the grave, its hopes and its duties, end quote. Like Huxley and Tyndall, he saw no inconsistency in reconciling science, seen as a world of fact, with religion, conceived of as a world of feeling and inwardness. Harrison affirmed that the scientific observer could, quote, share the religious emotion of every age and can enter into the language of every truly religious heart, quote. Though sympathetic to the importance of religious emotion, the scientific naturalists were critical of key concepts of Christian theology. Theology attempted to translate religious emotion into facts. Since science also dealt with facts, conflict between theology and science was an ever-present possibility. In their society papers, the scientific naturalists paid special attention to the theological doctrines of miracles and the soul. In his paper, The Evidence of the Miracle of Resurrection, Huxley pointed out that his expertise as a biologist gave him the authority to determine if the miracle of the resurrection actually occurred. Whether or not an organism can be said to be dead was, quote, a question of biology. And he believed that he should be permitted to deal with the question, quote, exactly as if it were one respecting which I expected to be called as an expert before some medico-legal tribunal, quote. Since Christ could have been somatically dead, these are the terms Huxley used, but not molecularly dead, the evidence for the miracle of resurrection would not stand up before a medico-legal tribunal. Huxley also gave papers on the soul early in the life of the society. In his paper, Has a Frog a Soul?, Huxley purposely used the detached clinical language of dissection as he methodically searched for some physical evidence that frogs had souls. Huxley's reliance on the language of physiology for discussing a cherished Christian belief would have been repellent to many members of the society. James Paradis, a scholar who's written a book on Huxley, has argued that Huxley intended his paper to be supremely ironical in the tradition of Jonathan Swift's Academy of Legato in his Gulliver's Travels. For a brief time, Huxley transformed the Metaphysical Society into what Paradis calls a dissecting theater of the absurd. Quote, Huxley's goal was to deflate the pretensions of Christian theologians to possess knowledge of transcendental truths. In addition to critiquing essential doctrines of Christian theology, the scientific naturalists questioned the method used by Christian thinkers to validate those doctrines. Both Lubbock and Harrison launched attacks on what they called intuitionism, The notion that all human beings had an intuitive faculty implanted in them by God that provided direct access to truths beyond empirical experience. In his essay, The Moral Condition of Savages, Lubbock denied that savages possessed an innate moral sense. Harrison, in his paper on the relativity of knowledge, dismissively refused to engage with intuitionism. The arguments for and against, quote, fail to interest me, he said, because I can get no practical good out of them, quote. If intuitions were implanted in all human beings, Harrison asked, why did the educated group of men with whom he shared his views not detect them in themselves, quote. In light of the insistence of scientific naturalists that truth was obtained only through empirical observation, and that the intuitionism of Christian theologians violated proper scientific methodological procedure, it can be fairly be asked, why did they agree to join the Metaphysical Society in the first place? Weren't scientific naturalists utterly opposed to all metaphysics? As Harrison pointed out in his paper on the supposed necessity of certain metaphysical problems, metaphysical discussions never advanced, quote, never were established as a fixed foundation on which all can proceed to build, end of quote. Harrison then compared the lack of progress in metaphysics with the growth of scientific knowledge. Whereas every metaphysician had to start without a fixed foundation, de novo, quote, nothing can be more in direct contrast with the course taken by science, Harrison contended. The knowledge slowly won by man over nature and her laws is progressive. While in metaphysics, we see only rockets, which whiz into the sky, crackle, and go out. In science, the torch is really carried on from age to age, lighting as it passes, quote. Despite their objections to traditional metaphysics, the scientific naturalists joined the Metaphysical Society to raise questions about its validity and to defend the superiority of science as they defined it. As the Duke of Argyll later observed in 1887, Huxley slyly used the term science to include metaphysics and philosophy. Quote, under cover of this wide sweep of his net, Argyll pointed out, he assumes to speak with the special authority of a scientific expert upon questions respecting which no such authority exists either in him or in anyone else. It was on the strength of this assumption that Huxley designates as pseudoscience any opinion or teaching or belief different from his own, quote. Huxley and his fellow scientific naturalists used the opportunity of the Metaphysical Society debates to put metaphysics under the rule of science, thereby confirming their authority to make definitive judgments on the value of Christian doctrines justified by intuitionism. In effect, their redefinition of science is also a redefinition of traditional metaphysics. Now, everything I've said so far, it's basically what you'd expect from the scientific naturalists. There's no real surprises there. What was surprising is when I looked at what the Christian metaphysicians were trying to do. Not so much in their critique of scientific naturalism, which I'll cover now, but you'll see in the next section where we talk about their views on science. If the scientific naturalists joined the Metaphysical Society to claim their place among the intellectual elite and to push for their redefinition of science, what were the motives of the Christian metaphysicians? To answer this question, we have to go back to the formation of the society and pick up a part of the story that I purposely left out. When Knowles originally came up with the idea for what was to become the Metaphysical Society, he had first referred to it as the Theological Society. His plan was to bring together all shades of religious and theological opinion, from the most conservative Roman Catholics to the most liberal Unitarians, to unite together in the common cause of counteracting the growing influence of scientific materialism. So, at first, the scientific naturalists were not going to be invited to join. However, James Martineau, a prominent Unitarian who was asked to be part of the society, could not approve of a society of Gnostics to put down agnostics, as he put it. Arthur Stanley, Dean of Westminster and a liberal Anglican, also believed that the plan for a theological society was just too narrow. He worried that excluding the unbelievers would just widen the breach between them and Christian intellectuals. And so Knowles was persuaded to drop the original plan for the society to serve as the basis for organized resistance to scientific naturalism. Huxley and other unbelievers were asked to join, and the name of the society was changed from the Theological Society to the Metaphysical Society to reflect the more ecumenical approach. Nevertheless, traces of the original plan survived. Some of the Christian metaphysicians who joined may have hoped to co-opt the scientific naturalists. J.H. Newman, who was one of the few intellectuals who declined to join the society, was shocked that his fellow Catholic, Cardinal Henry Manning, was willing to listen to a paper by Huxley that denied the reality of the resurrection. Quote, "Perhaps," Newman wondered, "it is a ruse of the cardinal to bring the professor into the clutches of the Inquisition." Failing conversion of the scientific naturalists, it is more likely that the majority of Christian metaphysicians aim to undermine the attempt of Huxley and his allies to redefine the meaning of science. Their papers not only challenge the assumptions of scientific naturalism, they also claim that a valid definition of science necessarily included a theistic framework. The scientific naturalists were outnumbered, so you see here a list of all the Christian metaphysicians, or the major ones. Catholics such as Ward, Manning, Delgaerns, and F. Gasquet presented 13 papers in total. High-ranking Anglicans, including C.J. Ellicott, who was Bishop of Gloucester and Bristol, W.C. McGee, Bishop of Peterborough, and William Thompson, Archbishop of York, accounted for 5 papers. F.D. Morris, Mark Pattison, and Stanley, all of whom were liberal Anglicans, contributed 4 papers. The Unitarian Martineau delivered 2 papers. Hutton, Sidgwick, and Russell, men who were not Christian ministers but who agreed with their goals, wrote papers attacking unbelief. Even some of the scientists in the society were devoutly religious and sympathetic to a critique of scientific naturalism. So St. George Mivart, a Catholic biologist, presented 3 papers. Henry Ackland, who was a professor of medicine at Oxford and director of the Radcliffe Museum, gave 1 paper. And William Carpenter, who was responsible for 4 papers, was a devout Unitarian. In their papers, the Christian metaphysicians presented an extensive critique of the assumptions that grounded scientific naturalism, starting with the empiricist methodology and ending with axiomatic concepts such as force, matter, uniformity, and cause. In his paper Diagnosis and Prescription, delivered on June 10, 1873, Manning offered a retrospect of the progress made since the society begun to meet about 4 years earlier. Despite the wide diversity of opinion, the members, he claimed, could be divided into 2 what he called ultimate schools that adopted 2 opposite methods. His own group took its starting point from reason and its intuitions. They believe that there are, quote, truths anterior to those of sense, end of quote. The other group, to which the scientific naturalists belong, confined reason within the circle and reports of sense. That's the phrase that Manning uses. Christian metaphysicians argued that empiricism, as a methodology for finding truth, was deeply flawed. Sidgwick's paper on the incoherence of empirical philosophy, for example, was devoted to demonstrating that going to experience for a test of truth did not yield, quote, a coherent system of philosophy on this basis, end of quote. Defective in its method for finding truth, scientific naturalism was also based on faulty axioms. Mivart argued that matter and force were mere abstractions. Manning agreed. We may know the weight and color of material objects, but these are merely the sensations that objects elicit in us. What, Manning asked, do we really know about the essence of matter? The atoms and forces conceived by the scientific naturalists were purely imaginary. The axiom of the uniformity of nature, defended by Stephen and Clifford as essential for scientific reasoning, was put to the test by W.G. Ward. If scientific naturalists accepted only the evidence of experience, he asked, how could they possibly demonstrate the validity of this axiom? Martineau, in one of his earliest papers delivered at the Society, raised the question, is there any axiom of causality? He turned the scientific naturalist conception of cause upside down. Humans are introduced to causality by observing our own wills in action, not by observing nature. Causes were not to be found in nature, they're actually in the human mind. Martineau had no objection to using what he called artificial abstractions like cause to obtain knowledge of the phenomenal world, but their artificiality had to be remembered. If the axioms of the scientific naturalists were flawed when applied to the natural world, they're just as problematic when used to think about ethics and religion. Hutton complained that Spencer offered no scientific evidence for his theory that moral perceptions were gained through experience by previous generations, rather than being intuitive in human nature. Quote, can we bring a single actual observation, Hutton asked, to testify to this supposed transformation of moral species, end of quote. After completing his analysis of evolutionary ethics, Sidgwick concluded that scientific naturalists were unclear on what constituted goodness. Some argue that happiness was the good that evolution tended to promote, while others said it was the preservation of life. Quote, "We are not likely," Sidgwick believed, "to extract from evolutionism a clear and more consistent view of the end of moral development than of the good which development generally is believed to promote." End of quote. Scientific naturalism was not only impoverished ethics, it also destroyed genuine religion. Referring explicitly to Huxley and Tyndall, Mivart declared, quote, "We are sometimes told that religion is a matter of feeling, not of reason, that it concerns not the intellect, but the emotions, and that it is independent of dogma." Quote. Mivart admitted that he could not understand what sort of religion the scientific naturalists referred to. Religion, in his mind, was an affair of reason and conduct, and it consisted of definite propositions or dogmas. Genuine religious emotion required the acceptance of the dogma that a divine being existed, that somehow gave rise to the perceptions of truth, beauty, and goodness in humanity. If you destroyed religious doctrine, as the scientific naturalists did, then religious emotion also disappeared. Mivart argued that to, quote, "talk of religious emotion, continuing to exist independently of religious conviction, is to talk mere nonsense and unmeaning verbiage, and that the religion of emotion can be but an inane nervous tremor, the religion of folly." Quote. For the scientific naturalists, traditional metaphysics engaged in fruitless speculation. If metaphysics was to survive in any meaningful way, it had to be subsumed by science, and it had to follow proper scientific method like any other discipline. By contrast, the Christian metaphysicians conceived of metaphysics as the examination of the grounds of scientific and religious belief. In the papers they delivered at the Society, they used metaphysics to deconstruct the principles upon which scientific naturalism was based. By subjecting their use of concepts of matter, force, uniformity of nature, and cause to a sustained critique, the Christian metaphysicians implied that the science of scientific naturalism was deeply flawed, and that scientific naturalists had no authority to speak on behalf of science. Moreover, the application of their defective principles to an understanding of ethics and religion was doomed to failure. Now we come to the really interesting part, I think, of the papers that were delivered in the Metaphysical Society, and that's the attempt of the Christian metaphysicians to build a science, a conception of science that was quite distinct from the one of the scientific naturalists. In the past, particularly in the older scholarship, the refusal of Christian metaphysicians to accept such concepts as causality and uniformity in nature, force and matter, was taken to be a rejection of the methods and theories of science in general. But Christian metaphysicians in the Metaphysical Society made it clear that their main target was the key assumptions of scientific naturalism and not science itself. They were fighting the attempt by scientific naturalists to redefine science and their claim to be the sole spokesman for science. Christian metaphysicians were not prepared to concede control of science to the scientific naturalists. On the contrary, after subjecting the science of scientific naturalism to a withering critique, they put forward their own scientific system based on metaphysical principles congenial to the central doctrines of Christian theology. Their science, in which intuition played a valid methodological role, incorporated miracles, the soul, and the existence of a divine being. W.G. Ward offered his vision of science on December 15, 1869, in his paper on memory as an intuitive faculty, which was the fourth paper delivered at the Metaphysical Society. After discussing the differences of fundamental principle between the empiricists and the intuitionists, he asserted that empiricism, quote, lays its axe at the root not only of all philosophy, but all religion and morality, quote. Then Ward offered his metaphysical justification for intuitionism. Intuitionists and empiricists agreed that the, quote, experiential faculties provided humans with access to the truth, quote. However, there were also other faculties that enabled us to know immediately certain truths in no way derived from experience. Ward mentioned an axiom of Euclidean geometry as an example. The intellectual acts whereby humans cognized these truths were called intuitions. Quote, these intuitions, Ward maintained, may with great scientific propriety be referred to various intuitive faculties, as, for example, man's various moral intuitions are referred to what is called the moral faculty, or less appropriately, the moral sense. Quote, the intuitive faculties of the mind, then, were legitimate sources of scientific knowledge. They were part of human reason, so there was nothing irrational in trusting that various subjective intuitions corresponded with objective reality. In addition to accepting the scientific legitimacy of intuition, Catholic members of the Metaphysical Society presented the metaphysical foundations of their science as part of a time-tested intellectual tradition dating right back to the Greeks. Delgaerns argued that the Aristotelian concept of the absolute was at the heart of science. Quote, science, he declared, has never gone back from Aristotle's discovery that the absolute is thought. Quote. Manning emphasized the debt of modern science, as he conceived it, to scholastic philosophy. The method of Thomas Aquinas took its starting point from, quote, truths anterior to those of sense, and of, quote, derived from reason and its intuitions, as opposed to the empiricist approach of confining reason to the reports of the senses. Aquinas began from, quote, the intellectual demonstration of the existence and nature of God, and from thence goes on to the nature of the soul, of human reason, will, and conscience, quote. This method, Manning affirmed, quote, pervades the ancient world and has guided the philosophy of the Christian world, end quote. It served as the basis of scholastic philosophy. And all science founded upon sense, he claimed, is accessory to it and interpreted by it. Manning tried to bring his Anglican colleagues into the scholastic fold by quoting from William Whewell on the relation between sensations and ideas. Whewell, one of the most eminent Anglican scientists of the second quarter of the century, and master of Trinity at Cambridge, had, according to Manning, offered a disinterring of the scholastic philosophy. His philosophy of science was St. Thomas Aquinas in a Cambridge gown. Armed with their scientific intuitionism, the Christian metaphysicians conceived of a science congenial to key Christian doctrines. Uniformity of nature could be thought of in a way that allowed for the occurrence of miracles. The scientific naturalists demanded the unexceptional uniformity of nature. But it was enough for inductive science, Ward believed, to view nature as being uniform most of the time, and violated by miracles in exceptional cases. Scientific naturalists denied the existence of the soul, but Christian metaphysicians saw no scientific grounds for reaching that conclusion. No proof had ever been offered, quote, except that the scalpel has not yet found the soul, quote, Manning declared. But through his consciousness of his relation to God, he intuited the existence of his soul. In a second paper, he announced, quote, I know nothing in modern metaphysics, nor in scientific reasoning, to induce me to doubt the existence of the soul or to attribute thought and volition to a material organism, except as a condition of its exercise in our present state, quote. The science of Christian metaphysicians also had room for God, in addition to the doctrines of miracles and the soul. Martineau drew an evolutionary theory, stealing many of Darwin's key terms to make the case for the existence of a final divine cause. After analyzing the characteristics of human intentionality, which he designated as selection, combination, and variation, he found the same marks of intentionality in nature. He concluded, quote, nature, then failing in none of these objective marks of intention, is no less certainly ruled by voluntary intelligence than are mankind, quote. Immanent purpose, he said, shaped the structure of the world. In effect, the Christian metaphysicians were arguing that science required a theistic framework in order to be viable. Carpenter insisted, quote, the man of science cannot dispense with the notion of a power always working through the mechanism of the universe, quote. There was a perfect conformity between the scientific idea of law as expressive of uniformity of action, Carpenter said, and the theological idea of will exerting itself with a fixed purpose according to a predetermined plan. To Carpenter, the revelations of science furnish theology with its best evidence of the existence of such a plan, quote. Through their papers at the Society, the Christian metaphysicians aimed to shake the foundations of scientific naturalism. Focusing on the axioms that grounded their vision of science was a brilliant strategy. Just as contemporary science and technology scholars have raised questions about modern science by analyzing the origins of basic scientific categories such as objectivity or experimental method, the Christian metaphysicians trained the sights of their weapons on the role of concepts of matter, force, uniformity of nature, and cause in the scientific system laid out by scientific naturalists. This strategy allowed them to deny Huxley and his allies the scientific and cultural authority that they craved. Their interpretation of the larger meaning of modern science for ethical and religious issues could be discarded. According to his son, Tennyson saw the object of the society as reining in the authority of the scientific naturalists. Tennyson thought that, quote, although evolution in a modified form was partially true, some of Darwin's disciples had drawn unwarrantable inferences from the theory and had arrogated to themselves far too much, quote. Many of the Christian metaphysicians saw the society as an opportunity to take on the scientific naturalists at close quarters. After attending one meeting, Bishop McGee boasted to his wife, quote, in my opinion, we the Christians had much the best of it, quote. But the Christian metaphysicians did not see this as a war between science and religion. While they rejected the metaphysical propositions underlying the science of scientific naturalism, they simultaneously defended a theistically grounded science compatible with the major doctrines of Christian theology. When the politician Arthur Russell came out of one of the earliest meetings of the society, a friend anxiously asked, well, is there a God? Russell replied, oh yes, we had a very good majority. And Russell could report that scientific arguments, as understood by the Christian metaphysicians, have been brought to bear in support of theism. If this was a war, it was between two opposing conceptions of science, with scientists ranged on both sides. While Huxley, Tyndall, Clifford, and others pushed for science in accordance with the dictates of scientific naturalism, Mivart and Carpenter championed to form science compatible with Christian metaphysics. The Metaphysical Society, then, was the scene of the Victorian version of the science wars as opposing forces battled to determine the proper definition of science. If the purpose of the society was to reach some kind of consensus within the intellectual elite on the important issues of the day, it was a complete failure. Leslie Stephen recalled that, quote, nobody's preconceived opinions were changed, not even so far as I know in the smallest degree affected by the discussions, end of quote. The scientific naturalists put forward their secularized vision of science and used it to undermine key Christian doctrines, while the Christian metaphysicians countered by attacking the scientific principles grounding scientific naturalism and espousing the virtues of theistic science. The historical significance of the Metaphysical Society really lies in revealing how the Christian metaphysicians of the 70s refused to concede control of science to Tyndall and his allies. They continued to view science, as they conceived it, as a rich resource for justifying Christianity, despite the impact of Darwin's theory of evolution and the growing power of scientific naturalism. Some of you will realize that the subtitle of my talk, which I can't remember if in some versions of my talk, if not this one, the subtitle contains the phrase contesting cultural authority. I don't think I have it in this one. And it's a not so subtle reference to the late Frank M. Turner's influential book, Contesting Cultural Authority. Ever since the publication of his book in 1993, historians of Victorian science have viewed the second half of the 19th century as a scene of a contest for cultural authority between the Anglican clergy and the scientific naturalists. An examination of the Metaphysical Society complicates Turner's big picture in three ways. First, and this has been the central point of this paper, it highlights how cultural authority was closely connected to scientific authority in this period. Unexpectedly, the Christian metaphysicians were not willing in the 1870s to relinquish their claim to scientific authority. They did not base their cultural authority on scientific grounds alone. My second concluding point follows from the idea that both groups aimed for scientific authority. In light of this commonality, perhaps we should not overemphasize the gulf between Christian metaphysicians and scientific naturalists, even though I've repeatedly drawn attention to their differing views on the nature of science. In the Metaphysical Society, they effectively banded together to try to reach a consensus on how to preserve the power of the current intellectual elite. And even if they did not achieve that goal, they did agree that certain issues, such as the basis of morality, the nature of belief, and the proper path to knowledge, were the crucial ones on which they should try to find common ground. Third, and here I draw on recent scholarship, including my own on the popularizers of science, we need to take into account the growing power of other groups within Victorian society who were able to take advantage of science in the last third of the 19th century to increase their cultural authority. The fascinating disputes within the Metaphysical Society between Christian metaphysicians and scientific naturalists should not blind us to the significance of the wider debates taking place outside of the society. You will recall that in my attempt to contextualize the Metaphysical Society in the first section of the paper, I discussed the reasons why members of the intellectual elite decided to create this extraordinary club. It was in response to social and cultural developments that threatened to undermine their status and to push Britain in directions to which they were utterly opposed. Although members of the intellectual elite may have wished to limit debate to those of their ilk by forming a private club that excluded women and the workers, once the meeting was over, they returned to a society where the cultural authority of both Christian metaphysicians and the scientific naturalists was being challenged. The contest for cultural authority was not only between Anglican clergy and scientific naturalists, which is Frank Turner's claim. Feminists, socialists, and others were claiming that they were qualified to provide leadership and that contemporary science supported their claims. So I'm arguing that Frank Turner's notion of a contest for cultural authority is still valid, but that we have to recognize that there were more contestants than he and subsequent scholars have acknowledged. We can build a more dynamic big picture of 19th century British cultural and intellectual life if we keep in view all those groups who saw science as a key to bolstering their claims to cultural authority. Doing so makes us more sensitive to different conceptions of science operating inside and outside the intellectual elite. And then a remarkable mosaic of sciences comes into view and challenges us to paint a richer picture of the ongoing contests for cultural authority that were distinctive at different times and places throughout the 19th century. Thank you.